You're standing in the middle of Times Square on what seems like the most ordinary night in New York. The LED screens are still blazing, car horns are still echoing off the glass towers, and the crowds are still pushing through streets that never truly sleep. But within just a few hours, everything begins to slip out of its familiar orbit. A man collapses right in front of a subway entrance, and everyone assumes it is a stroke. Minutes later, he rises again with cloudy eyes and starts tearing into anyone who comes near. In Queens, a hospital suddenly goes silent. In Brooklyn, traffic cameras capture chain reaction crashes as a mob rushes into the streets like walking corpses. And the most terrifying part is not that the death toll is rising by the minute, but that one of the most densely packed cities in America is unwittingly becoming the perfect incubator for a biological nightmare. If the T-virus, the same thing that turned Raccoon City into a mass grave in Resident Evil, were to truly erupt in New York, this would no longer be a story about a few monsters or scattered groups of survivors. This would be the collapse of an entire megacity, where a single day of chaos would be enough to shake the whole world.
In the world of Resident Evil, the T-virus is not just an ordinary disease-causing virus. It is a bioweapon that collapses the line between epidemic and military catastrophe. The infected do not simply suffer from fever, coughing, or exhaustion. Their bodies are twisted in the most horrifying ways imaginable. Death does not mean the end, because nerve tissue is reactivated, predatory instinct is pushed to the extreme, and almost everything human is erased.
From what happened in Raccoon City, one thing is brutally clear. Once the T-virus escapes into an urban environment, it is human mobility itself that becomes the most terrifying catalyst. Raccoon City was only a mid-sized city, yet it fell into an irreversible state in a short time, forcing the government to choose an extreme solution and erase the entire area. But New York is not Raccoon City. New York is vastly larger, far more crowded, far more interconnected, socially more complex, and most importantly, it cannot simply be sealed off like an isolated town. That fact alone would raise this scenario to an entirely different level of destruction. Now imagine the first point of outbreak not emerging from a secret laboratory hidden deep in the wilderness, but from within the ecosystem of a modern city itself. It could be a set of contaminated samples swapped during biomedical transport, a leak from a disguised private lab, or an underground organization trying to test social response in a densely populated environment. The ideal ignition point, from the ruthless perspective of whoever engineered the virus, would not be somewhere remote, but at the intersection of a hospital, a subway line, and a residential center. Manhattan, with its massive population density and endless human circulation, would be the perfect place to plant the seed. If only a handful of initial infections appeared in an emergency room, a subway station, and a crowded apartment complex, the city would not even realize it was entering the first hour of a biological disaster. The problem is that the T-virus gives modern society no time to classify, analyze, and respond by procedure. It destroys procedure before people can even finish their first emergency meeting. In the first 6 hours, the system would react in a very ordinary way, and that very sense of normalcy would open the door to catastrophe. Patients showing convulsions, extreme aggression, biting behavior, and resistance to sedatives would be treated as cases of acute psychosis, drug-induced violence, or some unidentified illness. Doctors, nurses, technicians, and hospital security staff would be the first line of direct exposure. When abnormal deaths begin happening one after another, but the bodies refuse to stay still the way they should, the hospital would become a massive infection nest within a single shift. At the same time, phone videos would start flooding social media. At first, people would assume it was staged footage, a movie marketing stunt, or a violent episode caused by synthetic drugs. No one would want to believe that dozens of people were being torn apart in the heart of the most modern city in the world. Local authorities would still be fumbling with terms like riot, medical crisis, and bioterror attack, while the virus silently multiplies through every bite, every drop of blood, and every corpse left behind in hospital hallways. 12 hours later, the chaos would begin to reveal its true shape. The subway would turn into a sealed hell, where cramped space and panic trap the living and the infected inside the same maze with no way out. A train car would stop in the middle of a tunnel because one passenger has turned violent, and screams would ripple from one carriage to the next. A bitten person might need only minutes, or perhaps a few dozen minutes, to collapse, and the next transformation would happen right in the middle of a packed crowd. Once major transit hubs like Times Square, Grand Central, and Penn Station all lose control at once, the wave of people fleeing to the surface would carry the infection into every other borough. On the streets, crashes would multiply as drivers panic, ambulances get stuck, and police forces are stretched thin by hundreds of emergency calls arriving at the same time. Television broadcasts would begin to shift in tone, no longer sounding like ordinary news updates, but like increasingly unstable warnings, because even the people in the studio would no longer be sure what they were looking at. This would be the moment New York realizes it is not dealing with an outbreak anymore, but with civilization being crushed from within. 24 hours after the first infection, the city would enter a state of fracture. Power would not be completely gone yet. The internet would still function in scattered zones, and some areas would still have running water, but public trust would be almost entirely shattered. Residential buildings would begin locking themselves down, using refrigerators, tables, chairs, and metal bars to block entrances. Supermarkets would be stripped bare, not simply because of greed, but because people would understand that once supply trucks stop moving, every bottle of water and every box of food becomes worth more than cash. The police would not have enough manpower to control a city of 8 million people coming apart at the seams. Their weapons were designed to suppress riots, not to stop a horde of undead that feels no pain and no fear. Every bullet to the chest would be almost meaningless, and the close-quarters nature of urban combat would make safe formations nearly impossible. By the time SWAT units are deployed to the hottest zones, they would quickly realize that the problem is no longer about taking down individual targets, but about the impossibility of distinguishing between those who can still be saved and those who are already about to turn. 36 hours later, Manhattan could become the most horrifying symbol of the entire event. The bridges and tunnels leading off the island would be locked down, but a quarantine order that comes too late would only trap hundreds of thousands of people inside a giant slab of concrete filled with infection. On rooftops, civilians would wave flashlights, white cloths, and blinking phones to signal helicopters overhead. Inside office towers, workers stranded since the night before would barricade themselves behind glass doors never built to withstand the force of a frenzied crowd. Hotels, shopping centers, and train stations would become temporary fortresses, only to turn into mass graves the moment a single overlooked injury slips through. In basements, maintenance levels, parking structures, and dark storage areas would create the perfect environment for more dangerous mutations to emerge. If the T virus strain in this scenario were concentrated enough, or altered the way Umbrella once altered its experiments, then New York would not just face ordinary zombies. It could also see stronger, faster, more durable variants, creatures capable of breaking through early military defenses with terrifying ease. At that point, the federal government would almost certainly intervene at full capacity. The National Guard would be deployed, airspace would be restricted, ports would be frozen, and highways in and out of the city would be immediately locked down with barriers, armored vehicles, and armed checkpoints. But every military response would be trapped in a brutal dilemma. If they prioritize large-scale rescue, the virus would spread with refugees across the entire northeastern corridor, potentially reaching Washington, Philadelphia, and Boston in a very short time. If they prioritize total containment, millions of people inside New York would effectively be abandoned in a dead zone. The lesson from Raccoon City is that once infection crosses a certain threshold, humanitarian choices begin colliding violently with the survival of the nation itself. What makes New York even more terrifying is its economic, financial, and symbolic importance. Every hour of lost control would not only add to the number of undead, it would shake markets, fracture supply chains, and spread panic across the globe. 48 hours later, the city would enter a stage where civilian maps no longer mean much. Boroughs would no longer be recognized by their familiar roles as financial districts, art centers, or residential zones, but by their survival rate. Some areas would still have power and organized defense groups. Others would be completely swallowed by darkness and screams. Brooklyn could become a hybrid battlefield of improvised militias, surviving police, and waves of undead flooding through rows of attached houses. Queens, with its dense web of roads and airports, would become a strategic hotspot that the military would be forced to hold at all costs to prevent the virus from escaping by air. The Bronx, with its dense neighborhoods and complex infrastructure, could lose contact in fragmented sections almost immediately. Staten Island might remain safer for a while because of its separation, but that same isolation would slow rescue efforts and drain resources faster. At that point, the city would no longer exist as a single entity, but as hundreds of tiny survival pockets surrounded by a sea of death. And in that environment, human nature would reveal itself completely. Some doctors would remain in hospitals until the very end just to guard the neonatal ward. Some firefighters would cut open escape routes for civilians, only to be swallowed in hallways filled with smoke and blood. Some police officers would spend their last bullet on a partner who had just turned, because there was no other choice. But there would also be those who exploit the darkness to loot, settle old grudges, seize food stores, and turn surviving groups into prisoners of fear. The T-virus would not just destroy the body, it would strip modern society down to its core. When the power grid flickers, phone signals cut in and out, food runs low, and corpses begin swelling in the damp cold of a New York winter, the thing holding people together would no longer be the law, but discipline, trust, and the willingness to sacrifice. And that would become the rarest resource in a city falling apart by the hour. The true climax would arrive when the conclusion emerges that New York can no longer be saved by conventional means. Once data from reconnaissance helicopters, thermal cameras, and ground reports all show that the infection clusters have fused into one continuous mass, any plan to rescue neighborhoods one by one would become meaningless. From there, the most horrifying debates imaginable would begin behind the doors of command centers. Should tactical bombing be used on districts that are already completely lost in order to create rescue corridors elsewhere? Should bridges be blown, tunnels collapsed, and entire boroughs isolated like sealed, contaminated compartments? Should the full truth be revealed to the public, knowing that it could send millions into total panic? And the most haunting question of all, would the government dare to repeat the ghost of Raccoon City in another form, when this time, the target is the symbolic heart of the United States? The mere possibility of that would be enough to fracture the nation's trust in government, the military, and every structure of authority that was supposed to protect civilians. If the final decision were to impose total quarantine and carry out district-by-district cleansing rather than annihilate the whole city at once, then New York would become the largest military maze in modern history. Every building would be numbered, every floor searched, every subway station turned into a close-quarters battlefield where soldiers would have to fire at targets only a few meters away. But that is only under the assumption that the T-virus remains at a basic infection level. At that point, every building would cease to be a rescue mission and instead become a living experiment where human beings are both victims and targets. If we extend the timeline further, from day 3 to day 7, New York would become the center of a global crisis. Financial markets would react violently, because Wall Street is not just a street, it is a central nerve of economic confidence. Other countries would shut their borders to arrivals from the United States, and airports around the world would tighten screening procedures until air travel nearly grinds to a halt. International media would broadcast non-stop images of helicopters circling over Manhattan, smoke rising from the avenues, and long lines of evacuees stopped at quarantine perimeters. Fear would spread farther than the virus itself, because everyone would understand that if New York can fall, then no megacity on Earth can still be considered untouchable. Tokyo, London, Seoul, Paris, Shanghai, all of them would look at this scenario as a dark prophecy of how fragile modern civilization really is, when the enemy is not another nation, but a pathogen engineered to turn the population itself into a weapon. But the worst ending would not necessarily be New York flattened in fire. A more terrifying ending would be a city that never fully dies, a city trapped in a half-living, half-dead state for weeks. Some areas would be retaken, others would remain permanently off-limits. Survivors would be brought out only to be held in quarantine camps, where everyone fears that they, or the person beside them, could transform at any moment. Thousands of children would lose their parents. Tens of thousands of families would never know where their loved ones died or what they became. Neighborhoods that were once vibrant would become silent voids filled with broken glass, abandoned cars, and flickering billboards glowing over frozen corpses. The city would still exist on the map, but spiritually, it would have become a new Raccoon City, only far larger in scale and far harder to erase from human memory with a single explosion. If you had to imagine the final image of this story, it might be a gray dawn spreading across the New York skyline after days of red fire. The Statue of Liberty would still stand in the harbor, but behind it would be a city torn apart, every window like an empty eye socket. On avenues once packed with yellow taxis, only military vehicles and shadowy figures would remain among the ruins. The subway would fall silent. Street music would vanish. The sound of distant helicopters would fade, replaced by wind moving through hollow concrete canyons. And the biggest question left behind would not be how many people died, but how a city that seemed impossible to break could collapse so quickly. The answer lies in the very nature of the T-virus and of modern urban life itself. When connection is your greatest strength, it also becomes your deadliest weakness. The faster New York lives, the denser it becomes. The more it depends on complex systems, the more catastrophic the collapse will be once a single link is poisoned. And that is exactly why a T-virus outbreak in New York would be even more terrifying than what Resident Evil once suggested through Raccoon City. Raccoon City was the first warning. New York would be the final proof that when a biological disaster enters the heart of the modern world, there is no city large enough to hide in and no system strong enough to preserve the old order. In the end, the city might be reclaimed by the military, burned away district by district, or buried beneath quarantine lines that last for years. But no matter the exact outcome, New York after the T-virus would never again be the New York humanity once knew. It would become a living monument to the moment civilization lost to something of its own making. A place that reminds us that the ultimate horror is not the monsters out there, but the moment we realize the entire city has become a giant body rotting from the inside.